In the quiet village of Umeus, lived a woman named Chinyo. A devoted Christian, she had one purpose in life, to serve her pastor, Reverend Okafor. Chinyo's dedication to the church and its leader became a talking point in the village. She was often seen at the church, helping with cleaning, cooking, and attending to Reverend Okafor's needs. But at home, things were very different. Her husband, Namdi, and her 3 children, Amoka, Ifoni, and little Chism, were slowly starving, not for lack of food, but for lack of care. The house was once filled with warmth, laughter, and the smell of delicious meals cooking on the stove. But since Chinyo's devotion had shifted almost entirely to Reverend Okafor, her family no longer recognized the woman who once nurtured them. Every morning, before the sun rose, Chinyo would quietly leave the house, heading to the pastor's compound to prepare his breakfast. By the time Namdi and the children woke up, there would be nothing but leftover gari to eat, while Reverend Okafor dined on pounded yam, chicken, and a variety of rich dishes, all prepared by Chinyo. Namdi's frustration grew daily. He couldn't understand what had happened to the woman he married. Wasn't the pastor supposed to encourage family unity, not tear it apart? Namdi sat at the dining table one morning, looking at the empty seat where Chinyo once sat. The children, half awake, were nibbling on the dry gari in their bowls. Little Chisholm tugged at his father's sleeve, her small voice barely audible. "Papa, when is Mama coming back?" Namdi's heart sank. His youngest daughter had not tasted a proper meal in weeks. He sighed, knowing that Chinyo was probably at the pastor's house, washing his clothes or cooking his favorite meals. The family no longer saw her until late in the evening when she returned, exhausted and with barely a word for her husband or children. That evening, when Chinyo returned, her hands were raw from scrubbing the pastor's laundry, and her face was weary. Yet, despite her tiredness, there was an unusual brightness in her eyes whenever she spoke of Reverend Okafor. Namdi knew he had to say something, but each time he opened his mouth to speak, he stopped. There was something almost unapproachable about her now, like she had built a wall between herself and her family. Chinyo's admiration for Reverend Okafor had begun years ago when he first came to Umeus. His sermons were powerful, his prayers effective, and his counsel wise. To Chinyo, he was more than a man of God, he was the embodiment of God's will. Every time she served him, it felt like she was serving God himself. Reverend Okafor noticed her devotion and often prayed for her, telling her how much her sacrifices were pleasing to the Lord. "You are a true servant, Sister Chinyo," he would say. "God sees your heart, and he will reward you." These words filled Chinyo with a sense of purpose, and she believed that through her service to the pastor, her family would be blessed. But with each passing day, her family grew more distant, and the blessing she so fervently sought seemed further out of reach. Namdi could no longer bear it. His children needed their mother, and he needed his wife. He approached Chinyo one evening, just after she returned from the pastor's house. She was in the middle of kneeling to say her evening prayers when he interrupted her. "Chinyo, we need to talk." She looked up at him, startled. "Namdi, can't you see I'm praying?" "What is it?" "I am your husband," he said firmly. "I am tired of living like this. You leave us every day to serve the pastor while your own family goes hungry. Your children eat gari while you feed the pastor pounded yam and chicken. Is this the way it's supposed to be?" Chinyo's face hardened. "Namdi, you don't understand. I am doing the Lord's work. Reverend Okafor is a man of God, and by serving him, I am serving God." "Serving God doesn't mean abandoning your family," Namdi replied, his voice rising. "Our children need you, I need you. But you're giving everything to the pastor. What about us?" Chinyo stood up, her hands trembling. "You don't understand. Reverend Okafor is a man of God, and he needs my help. You should be supporting me, not questioning my devotion." Word about Chinyu's devotion to the pastor and neglect of her family spread quickly through Umeus. At the market, women would whisper and shake their heads when they saw her. Can you imagine, one woman would say, her own children starving while she cooks for the pastor. Another would add, that's not devotion, it's madness. The gossip reached Reverend Okafor's ears, but instead of advising Chinyu to balance her responsibilities, he praised her even more. Do not listen to the voices of the world, Sister Chinyu. They are jealous of your righteousness. Chinyu took these words to heart. If anything, the criticism from the villagers only strengthened her resolve. She worked harder, cooked better meals for the pastor, and spent even more time at his house. But the rift between her and her family grew deeper with each passing day. Namdi tried once again to reach his wife's heart. One Sunday after church, he sat her down, his voice filled with desperation. Chinyu, I beg you. Look at our children. They need their mother. I am not asking you to stop helping the pastor, but please, don't forget us. We are your family. Chinyu looked at her husband, her heart conflicted. She could see the pain in his eyes, but Reverend Okafor's words echoed in her mind, God's blessings come through sacrifice. Namdi, she said softly, I am doing this for us. The more I serve the pastor, the more blessings will come to this family. You just have to trust me. But Namdi shook his head. What blessings, Chinyu? Our children are hungry, and you say blessings are coming. How long do we have to wait? Amoka, the eldest daughter, had always been close to her mother. But now, she barely recognized the woman who had once braided her hair and told her stories by the fire. One night, Amoka sat with Ifoni and Chisum, sharing the little Gary they had left. Tears filled her eyes as she watched her younger siblings eat in silence. She missed her mother's laughter, the warmth of her touch, and the delicious meals they once shared. Now, it was as though their mother had chosen the pastor over them. Amoka whispered to Ifoni, do you think Mama loves us anymore? Ifoni didn't know how to answer. All he could do was shake his head and continue eating. The sadness in the house was palpable, but Chinyu was blind to it. Reverend Okafor, though seemingly humble, began to expect more from Chinyu as her devotion grew. Each day she would arrive at his house earlier and stay later. He would hint at how much more peace he felt when she was around, always framing his needs as God's will. Chinyu, feeling chosen, gladly obliged. If Reverend Okafor needed freshly cooked meals twice a day, she would make them. If his clothes needed more attention, she would wash them by hand instead of sending them to the laundromat. Namdi noticed the increasing demands and could no longer stay silent. Chinyu, this is too much, he pleaded one evening. The pastor is taking advantage of you. He is a man, not God. Chinyu flared up at this. How dare you speak of him like that, Namdi? He is a man of God. He deserves our respect and service. You will never understand the things of the Spirit if you continue like this. Serving him is not wrong, but you've forgotten about us. Namdi shouted, his voice breaking with frustration. The children are suffering, and so am I. Is that what God wants? But Chinyu was unmoved. To her, the sacrifices her family made were a small price to pay for divine favor. The final straw came one rainy afternoon when little Chisum fell ill. Chinyu was at Reverend Okafor's house preparing lunch while Namdi and the children stayed home, trying to keep Chisum's fever down. Hours passed, and Chinyu still hadn't returned. Namdi sent Amoka to fetch her mother, but when she knocked on the pastor's door, Chinyu brushed her off. I'll be home soon, Amoka, she said, not even looking up from the pot she was stirring. I have to finish this meal. Amoka's face fell. But Mama, Chisum is very sick. She's crying for you. Chinyu hesitated for a moment, torn between her duty at the pastor's house and her daughter's plea. But the pastor, seated nearby, said softly, The Lord will take care of your family, Chinyo. Your service here is part of his plan. With that, Chinyo turned back to her cooking, leaving Amoka to walk home in tears. When Amoka returned without their mother, Namdi's anger boiled over. He watched helplessly as Chisholm's condition worsened, holding her small, burning body close to his chest. Your mother, she's forgotten about us, he whispered, his voice heavy with grief. That night, as the rain beat down on the roof of their small house, Chisholm's fever spiked. Namdi could hear the shallow, labored breaths of his youngest child. He paced the room, glancing every few minutes at the door, hoping Chinyo would finally return. But the door stayed closed. In a panic, Namdi carried Chisholm through the rain to the village clinic. As the doctor examined her, Namdi's heart raced. Please, God, he prayed, don't let anything happen to her. Meanwhile, at Reverend Okafor's house, Chinyo had just finished cleaning up after dinner. She glanced at the clock and realized how late it had become. Rushing home, she found the house dark and empty. Panic gripped her chest as she searched each room, calling out her children's names. When no one answered, fear set in. Chinyo grabbed her shawl and ran through the rain-soaked streets to the clinic. When she arrived, she found Namdi sitting outside, drenched and silent, his eyes filled with anger and hurt. Where is she? Where's Chisholm? Chinyo asked, breathless. Namdi stood slowly, his eyes piercing hers. She's inside, burning with fever. The doctors are with her. I hope you're happy now. Chinyo's knees buckled as guilt washed over her. She had never seen such pain in her husband's eyes. All she could do was weep. The next morning, after spending a sleepless night at the clinic, Chinyo went straight to Reverend Okafor's house, her heart heavy with guilt and confusion. She had neglected her own child in the name of service, and the weight of it was suffocating. Reverend, I don't know what to do anymore, she confessed. My family is falling apart. Chisholm is sick, and Namdi, he's angry. Have I been wrong all this time? Reverend Okafor listened quietly before speaking in his calm, authoritative voice. Sister Chinyo, you have been chosen for a great task. God's work often requires sacrifice. You must not allow the distractions of the world to cloud your faith. Your family will be fine. Trust in the Lord's plan. Though his words were meant to reassure her, Chinyo felt a gnawing doubt in her heart. Was this truly God's will, or had she taken things too far? When Chinyo returned home later that evening, Namdi was waiting for her. His face was stern, and his eyes were red from sleepless nights. We need to talk, he said, his voice cold. I can't do this anymore, Chinyo. Chinyo sat down, her hands trembling. Namdi, I know I've been neglecting you and the children. I've been trying to serve the Lord. Namdi interrupted her, his voice rising. Serving the Lord doesn't mean abandoning your family. Our daughter almost died last night because you were too busy cooking for the pastor. Chinyo flinched at his words, tears filling her eyes. I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I thought I was doing the right thing. You're not, Namdi said sharply. You've forgotten your responsibilities as a wife and mother. We're your family, Chinyo. Not the pastor. For the first time, Chinyo felt the full weight of her actions. She had been blinded by her devotion to Reverend Okafor, and in the process, she had lost sight of what truly mattered, her family. The days that followed were difficult for Chinyo. Chisholm eventually recovered, but the damage to her family was undeniable. The house felt colder, the children more distant. Namdi barely spoke to her, and when he did, his words were short and clipped. Everywhere she went in the village, people stared. She heard the whispers, saw the way women shook their heads when she passed by. The shame weighed heavily on her. One evening, as Chinyo watched her children silently eat the simple meal she had prepared, she realized how much she had taken them for granted. She had been so consumed by her desire to serve Reverend Okafor that she had failed to notice her children's hunger, both for food and for her love. As Chinyo began to distance herself from Reverend Okafor, trying to rebuild her relationship with her family, she noticed something unsettling. The pastor, who had always seemed so kind and wise, began to show signs of impatience. When Chinyo started arriving later or not at all, his tone with her changed. "Sister Chinyo," he would say sternly, "you are sleeping in your service. Have you forgotten the blessings that come with sacrifice?" Chinyo felt a pang of guilt, but something about his words no longer sat right with her. For the first time, she questioned whether Reverend Okafor's demands were truly godly or if they were self-serving. One night, Nnamdi sat Chinyo down and gave her a choice. "You have to decide, Chinyo. Is it going to be us, or the pastor? Because I won't let this continue." Chinyo looked at her husband, her heart heavy. She knew she had pushed him too far, and now, she was at a crossroads. Would she continue to serve Reverend Okafor at the expense of her family, or would she finally put her family first? Torn between her devotion to the church and her love for her family, Chinyo found herself at a breaking point. The tension in her home was unbearable, and the distance between her and Nnamdi grew wider each day. Her children no longer smiled when they saw her, and even little Chisholm seemed unsure around her. One Sunday after service, Chinyo lingered at the church, avoiding going home. She found herself kneeling at the altar, tears streaming down her face. "God, what do I do?" she prayed. "I thought I was serving you, but now I feel lost." As Chinyo sat crying in the empty church, she heard a soft voice behind her. It was Mama Yuzo, one of the elders in the village. She had seen the way Chinyo's life had spiraled out of control and decided to speak up. "My daughter," Mama Yuzo said gently, sitting beside her, "the Lord does not ask for sacrifices that destroy your home. You must find balance. Your family is your first ministry." Chinyo looked at the old woman through her tears. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought serving the pastor would bring blessings to my family." Mama Yuzo smiled sadly. "The pastor is just a man, Chinyo. Your service to God does not require you to abandon those who depend on you. Go home. Love your husband. Love your children. That is where your true calling lies." Chinyo took Mama Yuzo's words to heart. That night, she returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. She sat down with Nnamdi and her children, apologizing for all the pain she had caused. "I lost my way," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I thought I was serving God, but I was wrong. You are my family, and I've neglected you. I am so sorry." Nnamdi listened quietly, his expression softening for the first time in weeks. "I've missed you, Chinyo," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "We all have." Chisholm crawled into her mother's lap, and Chinyo held her close, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in a long time, she felt whole again. Chinyo began to rebuild her relationship with her family, one day at a time. She spent more time with her children, cooking their favorite meals and listening to their stories. Nnamdi, too, slowly began to trust her again, though the road to healing was long. Reverend Okafor, noticing Chinyo's absence from his home, sent word to her, asking why she no longer came to serve him. Chinyo, now stronger in her resolve, replied politely but firmly. "I must care for my family, Reverend. I've realized that they are my first responsibility." The pastor, sensing that he had lost his hold over her, did not press the matter further. Months passed, and the warmth returned to Chinyo's home. The children were happy again, and Nnamdi's smile, once lost in the shadows of disappointment, now reappeared. Chinyo still attended church and served in the ways she could, but never again did she allow her devotion to take her away from her family. In the end, Chinyo learned that true blessings come not from sacrificing those you love, but from cherishing and caring for them. As she sat with her family one evening, watching the sunset, she felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, she knew she had found her way back.